Hello viewers and my dear students. This is Dr. Dipankar Parvi, Department of English, and I hold the post of Assistant Professor of that particular department of Hijli College in Kharagpur, West Bengal. This is another new video lecture, and this lecture will be dedicated to another stalwart of British Romantic poetry, British Romantic literature, that is Percy Bysshe Shelley, who is popularly known as P.B. Shelley, and a particular sonnet, Ozymandias, has been included in the undergraduate syllabus of our university, and our present students have requested me to prepare a video lecture for their benefit, and I would definitely help them through this lecture. But before I start the poem, I would like to tell all of you that going through a text would be much more easier if you have an idea of that particular authors, that particular poets, biographical sketch, a little bit of timeline, as well as the basic poetic characteristics that particular poet or that particular author possessed. So I would like to divide my Shelley episode into two video lectures. The first one, which I am delivering now, is dedicated to the timeline and the brief biographical sketch of Percy Bysshe Shelley and his poetic characteristics, the main features of his poetic writings and poetic outputs, and the second one that will come next to this will be entirely dedicated to that particular sonnet, Ozymandias, and there I will analyze the entire text word by word and line by line. So before I start the poem, here in this video lecture I would like to tell you something about the biographical sketch of P.B. Shelley. So P.B. Shelley was born in the year 1792 in a very conservative aristocratic family. His grandfather, Sir Bysshe Shelley, was the richest man in Horsham, Sussex. Sussex is a particular county in England, and his father, Shelley's father, was Timothy Shelley, who was also a member of British Parliament. Shelley himself was in line to become a baron. His education began at the age of 6 under Reverend Edwards, a well-educated person, and he learned his Latin and Greek from that part of the Welsh education. In 1802, he was sent to Sion House Academy, Brentford, where which is odd, as the school was popular with tradesmen's sons. He then went to Eton in 1804, where he became adept in Latin verse. So while at Eton, he began reading Gothic mysteries and tales of horror that opened the world, opened the vista of vampirism, violence, kind of eroticism, magic, gloomy settings for his mind, for his imagination. He developed a kind of keen interest in science, including such things as electrical mechanics and fire balloons also. He left Eton just before his 18th birthday for Oxford, where he continued to be a voracious reader and a writer as well. His religious skepticism gained substance with the study of philosophical writings of Locke and Hume. In Oxford, he collaborated with his friend James Hogg, which is very known incident, and in each and every literature, history of literature book mention this particular incident of collaborating a particular pamphlet with his friend James Hogg, and that particular pamphlet is entitled The Necessity of Atheism, which claimed that God to be a non-variable phenomenon and that to atheism. So I quote a particular phrase from there: no degree of criminality is attachable, unquote. This is or this was made very sternly by the university. The university authority didn't permit at all, and they summoned Shelley and Hawke both, and ultimately they both were expelled from Oxford in 1811, causing an ever widening rift with his father. So Shelley immediately departed from London. So this is the one of the noticeable incident that Shelley had in his lifetime. But if we study Edward Albert's History of Literature book, there Edward Albert has mentioned, I quote a line from his text, that Shelley was frequented graveyards, studied alchemy, and read all books of dreadful imports. So this particular fascination, so going to the graveyards or studying alchemy and books of dreadful imports, which I have already mentioned, is that a kind of Shelley's childhood knack, a kind of Shelley's eccentricity of character. So this particular eccentricity, this particular characteristic was formed from the very beginning of his life. And after expulsion from Oxford by the university authority, what did he do? He in 1813 was a very momentous year for Shelley. So besides becoming a disciple of William Godwin, Shelley's first poetic work, that is Queen Mab, was printed privately. He fell in love with Godwin's daughter, the Mary Shelley, and being already married at the age of 16, Shelley fled to France with Mary and her stepsister Claremont. Shelley was opposed to the institution of marriage as yet another form of tyranny and codified degradation. So but despite this philosophy, he entered his second marriage to Mary Shelley in 1818. Shelley was treated as a social outcast for his reputation as an atheist and as an immoralist. So he moved to Italy and continued his restless exercise there. He met Byron and began an ambivalent friendship with him. Much personal tragedy followed in the form of tragic suicide by his first wife and the death of his two children from Mary Shelley. This proved to be a prolific creative period. Nonetheless, his masterpieces like Prometheus Unbound and Adonis being written around that time, Shelley died a very tragic death by drowning in 1822 when he was returning from Italy in his personal boat Don Juan. And Shelley has been hailed for his revolutionary fervor and the lyricism of poetry. He was always known for his revolutionary spirit and his the liberty that he professed, and his lyricism. Lyricism is particularly the best thing that we can get from his poetry. And besides, he is remembered for his great prose also. A Defense of Poesy, which was published in 1821, a kind of philosophical reading, is one of the most important manifestations of romantic movement, where famously he hails the poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So, so this is the basic biographical sketch of P.B. Shelley, which we need to know before we proceed to the characteristics, features of his poetry, and some of his special outputs as a literary author, or as a great romantic stalwarts of English literature. So let us discuss some of his poetic outputs, poetic works that he is renowned for. Shelley wrote a large number of poems, both long and short as well. His earliest poetical work of any importance is of Queen Mab. So Queen Mab, which was published in 1813, which he wrote in 18. Queen Mab is at the age of 18. Queen Mab is a fairy who carries off the spirit of the maiden Ianthe and expounds to her the causes of the miserable state of the present world. This fairy finally reveals to her the future state of regenerated world. The poem particularly attacks the dogmatic religion, government, industrial tyranny, war, marriage, and property as well. It also embodies Shelley's dream for the golden millennium. So Shelley had a vision to have a kind of golden millennium, and that particular desire is being reflected in this particular poetical work, Queen Mab, which was published in 1830. And his next poem, which is very famous, is Alastor. Alastor, or it is popularly known as Spirit of Solitude, which was published in 1816. And this poem is a kind of spiritual autobiography, and in its chief character, the projection of Shelley's own personality, wanderers as a wanderer, as a restlessly through a wilderness in search of a loved dream maiden, who will satisfy his love of beauty, his desire for his searching for the true beauty. The poem is long, rather obscure, and is formless. So it is chiefly remembered for its lyrical passages and typically the Shelleyan imageries. So it contains charming description of nature and embodies Shelley's undying hope in some better than that it is to come, that something better will definitely come, and with that vision he had written that particular long poem Alastor, or the Spirit of Solitude, and published in 1816. And this particular poem was followed in 1818, the Learn and Cynthia, and which was the once most suppressed and published letter as Revolt of Islam. I should say that it has been revised. It has been revised and later published as Revolt of Islam. So it was written in Spenserian stanzas at a time when the reaction that had followed the fall of Napoleon brought much misery among the poorer classes and stirred Shelley's revolutionary idealism. So it is a symbolic tale. Cynthia, the heroine, maiden, united with Lan in a common cause for man's emancipation, rouses the spirit of revolt among the people of Islam against their tyrants. So the revolt succeeds for a time, but the tyrants soon return to power. So Leon and Cynthia are burnt at the stake. The poem embodies Shelley's revolutionary idealism also, and his purpose is to express in this poem, and he tells that in his preface to this poem, to enkindle in the bosom of the reader a virtuous enthusiasm for the doctrines of liberty and justice, the faith of hope in something, hope in something good, to illustrate the growth and progress of individual mind aspiring after excellence and devoted to the love of mankind, to the most celebrated love, or as the sole law governing the moral world. So love can be the only solution as per Shelley. So the hero of the poem is Shelley himself. Like his creator, Lone seeks to accomplish his mission through the force of words. Next, he composed in Rome 1819 one particular work that is entitled The Cenci. The Cenci, which was published in 1819, it is a tragedy in which Shelley for the first time and for the only time descends to reality. The heroine Beatrice, driven to desperation by the monstrous wickedness of her father, kills him and is put to death in consequence. So in 1820, he published a superb lyrical drama, that is Prometheus Unbound, and it represents the triumph of mankind over the forces of evil, and which corrupts human society and the mind of the man, leading to the foundation of an ideal state on the earth. It is concerned with the torments of the Greek mythological figure Prometheus, who defies the gods and gives fire to humanity, for which he is subjected to eternal punishment and suffering at the hands of Zeus. So this is the basic mythological construct with which this particular drama was constructed by Shelley. And here the hero Prometheus represents mankind, a just and noble humanity chained and tortured by Jove, that is Jupiter, who represents a cruel human institutions. Despite all his tortures, he does not submit to the tyrant Jupiter. He is supported by Asia, who stands for the supreme power in the universe, eternal love. In due time, Demogorgon, who represents necessity, overthrows Jove and releases Prometheus, who is then united to his bride Asia. Then the reign of love follows, when thrones, altars, judgments, seats, and prisons are things of the past. The historical importance of Prometheus Unbound lies in the fact that it gives a kind of fullest and finest expression of Shelley's revolutionary enthusiasm and his undying hope for the golden millennium that I have already told. In 1821, he published Hellas, and this is nothing but a lyrical drama which was inspired by the Greek proclamation of independence, followed by the war of liberation from the Turks. In form, it follows the Percy and Aeschylus. In drama, the drama is remarkable for some of the finest lyrical part and the mouths of the chorus of the captive Greek woman. The poems of this particular period, starting from 1818 to 1821, are extraordinary in their number and quality. Among the longer poems are Julian and Madalo, published in 1818, The Mask of Anarchy, published in 1819, and The Witch of Atlas, published in 1820, Epipsychidion, that is published in 1821, and Adonis in 1821. So Epipsychidion celebrates Platonic love. It is the most impalpable and so one of the most characteristic of all Shelley's works. It was inspired by a beautiful Italian girl, Viviani, who was put into a cloister against her will, and in whom Shelley imagined he found his long sought ideal of womanhood. And this has been referred in William J. Long's his short history of English literature book. Adonis is also a song of grief over the death of the poet Keats and modeled on the classical elegy. So among the shorter lyrics mentioned may be made of To a Skylar, very famous poem, The Cloud, where we find Shelley's myth-making power, and the Indian Serenade, and Tonight, and Ode to West Wind, obviously. So this is somehow a kind of biographical sketch or biographical construct, as well as the poetical output and poetical construct and his authorial construct of Percy Bysshe Shelley in a very nutshell. Before we proceed his characteristics and of writing, or his romantic traits, we need all these things. And next I will discuss the features of Shelleyan poetry, the features with which Shelley has become a renowned stalwart in romantic British literature. So, uh, celebrated critic J.A. Simons once told that regarding Shelley, P.B. Shelley, he told that Shelley contributed a new quality to English literature. And what are these qualities? A quality of ideality, a quality of freedom, a quality of audacity, which severe critics of other nations think we lack, we really lack. So, Shelley's contribution to literature, romantic literature, can be summed up in several points, and which will feature out his main characteristics. The first point will be his lyrical power, will be his lyrical quality. So Shelley's genius is essentially purely lyrical. In none of his greatest contemporaries was the lyrical faculty was so paramount and so greatly expressed. And whether we consider his smaller or longer poems, or of his odes, or his dramas, we see that he was the loftiest and the most inspired singer in the English literature. So lyricism is the inherent essential quality that we may mention first for featuring out the characteristics of his writings. As Swinburne also says that he stands alone among singers, and he is the perfect singing God. There is nothing unfelt and insincere in his writing. He composed his verses with all his faculty, mental, emotional, and physical, at the wild heat of intense emotion and passion, and gave the truest and the most forceful expression to his thoughts, and shaped and colored his extraordinary imagination through this lyricism. So there is an ecstasy bordering on the madness of his poetry. So the next point that may be considered is the spontaneity. The spontaneity is marked by utmost out of his writings, out of his poetry. So which is one of the greatest lyrical qualities. So spontaneity must be there. Unless there is spontaneity, there is no there cannot be any romantic literature, there cannot be literature as well. So Shelley exhaled verse as a flower exhales fragrance, and just as the fragrance to a blossom varies in quality and power, so did Shelley's verse vary in poetic merit. The essential point is that there is no effort or laborious artistry about it at any time. So rhythm can also naturally to him as he is breathing. So rhythm and breathing has been synonymous for him. So spontaneity is the second point, and this particular feature has been recognized in Crompton Ricketts' very noticeable history of English literature book, where he gave this particular comparison of spontaneity and rhythm and breathing. So the next point, in one respect, Shelley as a lyricist maker is a departure from all other lyricists. Lyric is the reproduction of the mental life of the lyricist. The poet gives expression to his personal emotions and feelings in the moments of vivid sensation. But Shelley's lyrics do not give us as much of that as we felt and thought of what he desired and aspired after. He sought throughout the brief span of his life for what he exists in the realm of imagination, for what lies in the womb of future. So this is the difference with other lyricists, that we can recognize him, Shelley, as a different lyricist with others. So the next point is revolutionary idealism and reformative zeal. So more than any other romantic poets of his generation, Shelley was the inheritor and exponent of the ideals of French Revolution. So the revolution aroused and then disapproved Wordsworth, causing him to turn away from the political ideals and to seek comfort and consolation in nature. It made Byron, the French Revolution made Byron a rebel and Sade a laureate. But it gave birth to Shelley. I quote from Crompton Ricketts' book: in spite of its failure as a humanitarian movement, a movement designated to extend liberty and equality all alike, irrespective of sex, caste, nationality. With the outburst of the Napoleonic campaign, Shelley still clung to its ideals. The spirit of revolution, uncompromising, shattering, eager to build in a day the structure with which long centuries of growth must fashion, being still fresh in his mind. So, this is the quotation from Crompton Ricketts' celebrated book, A History of English Literature, where Crompton Ricketts categorically mentioned the idealism and the reformative zeal of P.B. Shelley. The next, Shelley held the social, political, and religious institutions responsible for the evils he found around him. To him, superstition embodied in the priest is one of the root evils. The other is the existence of power embodied in the king. So he considered all authority of one being over the other is a kind of evil. Authority is something which is very evil. So Shelley derived his concept of evil from Godwin, according to whom evil lies in positive institutions, all of the organizations, all the organs of authority that man has created. So Shelley, however, believed that evil was not inherent in the system of creation but an accident that might be removed. He thought that mankind had only to will that there should be no evil and there would be none. So he made it his poetic mission to open the eyes of man to the oppressions and injustices he suffered from, thereby, and enkindled in his mind the desire of overthrowing the positive institutions which were responsible for the sad life of the people. With that vision, Shelley is not a rebel but who takes pleasures in sheer destruction. He is a reformer too. So his rebellious attitude towards the present order of things bred in him the burning desire of reformation or reforming the world. He wanted to destroy the existing order of things, and he could build its ruin, on its ruin, a new structure, a new establishment based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this theme of most of his poems is the contrast between the world as it is and the world as it should be or it ought to be. So he also believed that the big gap between these two worlds could be breached, and the changes he desired could be affected through the reforms of political institutions as well as the elimination of religious superstitions. So in Queen Mab, he presented, or rather I should say, he preached the necessity of reform. He wanted to be the legislators of the world. And one important characteristics of Shelley is his poetic or prophetic quality, the prophetic note. So if I explain it in a little more, then I should say that there is no denying of the fact that a kind of deep, melancholic, sad note runs through most of his poems, mostly of all of his poems. So he was melancholy because he could not reconcile the hard facts with the ideal. But this personal despondency did not give birth to the unmanly feeling of despair as it did in the case of Byron, but rather, so far as the humanity and the world at large were concerned, this attitude was one of the perennial hopefulness. This spirit of hopefulness leads him to take to the role of a prophet. So he purged through the poetry that happiness would follow misery. So happiness definitely will come when the clouds of misery will disperse, so that the evils and corruption would soon clear away, ushering a new era of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The millennium of his dream, as he says in his Ode to the West Wind, the famous celebrated line, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" So this is the prophetic note, and the next characteristics is the dreamlike quality. A dreamlike quality that embedded almost all the poetry produced by P.B. Shelley. So Matthew Arnold once called Shelley a beautiful and ineffectual angel beating in the void in his luminous wings in vain. So Shelley's poetry is made of baseless fabric of vision, and it lacks in human interest. So the scene of Shelley's poetry is laid in most cases in an ethereal celestial region, and he figures who inhabits this region are not figures of this world, but the figures of the dreamland. The skylark is not a bird of flesh and blood. Amelia in Epipsychidion is hardly a human being. She is an idea, a thought, rather than a mortal creature. So the ideal of beauty as he conceived it cannot be attained on earth. He was driven to find the image of that abstract beauty in real woman, and yet when he attempted to realize it in any woman, he fell far below the image, with which the result that he was driven back again from the women on earth to the ideal of soul. So thus he beat his wings in vain and had no peace of mind. In the political sphere, he attempted something impossible. He tried to bring about in a day the golden millennium which long centuries of growth must fashion. So Shelley was more at home in some ideal, impalpable world of his imagination than in the one of the living men and women. Possessed by the desire of escape, he gazed on nothing of earthly build. Every visible earthly object is merely the startling point for the cobwebs of dreams. So his thoughts travel incessantly from what he sees to what he desires. So his devotion is to something afar from the sphere of our sorrow. The next point that I am going to discuss is his attitude towards nature. So romantic poetry being essentially returned to nature, here also we find that Shelley's poetry is of nature. Shelley loved the variable and indefinite aspects of nature, like the cloud, like the sky, the birds, river, fountain, mountain, etc. He was the poet of the dawn, of gorgeous sunset and the storms. Like the old Greeks, he personified nature and believed that numerous deities peopled the different objects of nature. His treatment of nature bears the stamp of his myth-making faculty. Myth-making power, myth-making faculty or quality of imagination, it personifies the object of nature and speaks of the doings in terms of human action and will. Shelley was in the habit of endowing the earthly objects with celestial gleam. The objects of nature he described are made something transcendental in beauty by the glowing colors of his imagination. They are of the earth, but they are made of radiant with a light that never was on land or on sea. The beauties of nature were dearest to him as imagining yet more exquisite and divine beauty. And his melody and music is also another important characteristic. Shelley esteemed not for his ideas which animate his poetry, but for the haunting melody of his rhythm and the spontaneous music of his verse. He is a moonlight visitant and soothes the souls with melodies of words and beautiful images when, when the bonds of reality are loosened. So, as a prophet, he is lightly esteemed, but when once the prophet's mantle is gently removed from his shoulder by tender official hands, he is welcome to stay with us and to delight us with the subtle marvels of his lyrical craft and the iridescent play of his creative fancy. The next point is his mysticism. So, like Browning, Shelley is also a love and beauty mystic. So, he looks upon love as the solution of the mysteries of life, as he think it as a link between man and God. To Shelley, this was a glorious institution which reached him through his imagination, where the life of a man as he saw it is roused in him a little bit of mad indignation, wild revolt, and passionate protest. So Shelley believes in a soul of the universe, in which all things live and move and have their being, which at one feels in the Prometheus also, is unnameable, inconceivable even to man for from the depth of his imageless. So his most passionate desire was not, as was Browning's, for an increased and ennobled individuality, but for the mystical fusion of his own personality with the spirit, the object of worship and adoration. Next, Shelley's melancholy, which I have already mentioned a little bit, it is the unsatisfied desire, this painful yearning which is recurring disappointment and disillusionment that is at the root of Shelley's melancholy. And his poetry is the poetry of desire. He is always yearning, never pouring forth the strains of thankful satisfaction. So it is either the craving for an expectant rapture or the aching of a several nerve. And this is the great distinction which separates him from the other poetical mystics of the day. So his melancholic trait can easily be found in several lines of his poetry. And the next point that I am going to discuss is the love for liberty. So, like Byron, Shelley had a passionate love for freedom. He was profoundly influenced by the French Revolution. He was a shown foe of tyrants and tyranny. Freedom for all mankind is one of the important features of the golden age which he anticipates, the golden millennium. So when Greece made a declaration of independence from the Turkish yoke, he wrote a play to celebrate the occasion, Prometheus Unbound. A lyrical drama is at the best. So it shows the revolutionary enthusiasm of P.B. Shelley. So Shelley's philosophy was that the existing tyranny of state, church and society keeps man from growth growth into the perfect happiness. So perfect happiness can always be hindered by the existing tyranny of state, church and society. And the next point is that his ethereal quality of his poetry. Ethereal. There is a vagueness and abstractness and ethereal quality about the poetry of Shelley. It is the poetry of a man living not on earth but in the aerial region above. So his ethereality in his poetry is due to the want in general of a sound subject matter. Even in Adonis, which is a poem of grief on the death of kids, he represents and preserves a sense of unreality and calls in many shadowy allegorical figures. He talks about the metaphysical powers of intellectual beauty and the vagueness or vague things like the golden age of mankind. His imagery too is abstract and divorced from the human life, as he thinks delight in giving us a picture of the shifting and changeful phenomenon of nature like clouds, sunset, wind, sky, ocean, etc. etc. And he employs intense similes which, instead of making him meaning concrete, renders its vague. Next point is very important, is Platonism. Shelley was greatly influenced by Plato, the great Greek philosopher. Plato thought that the supreme power in the universe was the spirit of beauty. So Shelley borrowed this conception from Plato and developed it in his metaphysical poem, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. Intellectual beauty is omnipotent and man must worship it. So Shelley tells us in his poem that early in his life he vowed that he would dedicate his life to its worship and asserts that he has kept the vow. So there are Platonic touches elsewhere in Shelley's poetry, and Platonic metaphysics contributes to the ethereal quality also of his poetry. So another characteristic feature is his attitude to nature. So like all romantic poets, Shelley loves nature deeply. As Wordsworth, nature to him is a living reality capable of feeling and thinking, but he sees the spirit of love in nature. On the whole, therefore, he is a pantheist, one who sees the divine spirit behind the objects of nature. So, but his attitude to nature is also distinctive. In the first place, he has a performance for the dynamic aspects and the shifting and cheerful phenomenon of nature, like the cloud, the west wind, and the ocean, the sunset, the storms, etc. etc. He wrote a poem on the cloud, another on the west wind, and while his poems contain scores of pictures and the changeful and shifting scenery of nature, again he possesses the myth-making power in regard to the force of nature. He regards the cloud, the west wind, the skylark as separate and distinct individualities. He personifies them and conceives of them as having lived of their own. So, but it must be remembered that he does not invest them with human qualities or passions. The wind remains a wind for him, and the cloud remains a cloud for him. In this respect, his attitude to natural forces is also scientific. Even a scientist will endorse his pictures of natural processes and phenomena as regards their truth. And next I would discuss his imagery or his pictorial quality. So Shelley's imagery is kaleidoscopic, that he does not give one or two pictures at a time, but a whole series of them. So in Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, for instance, we have a picture of summer, winds creeping from the flower to flower, moonbeams falling behind some tiny mountains, the hues and harmonies of evening, clouds in straight windy spread, all these one after another. So these are the traits of natural or pictorial imagery that we found in his poetry. Next, we would come to discuss about that his Greek mythology, love for Greek mythology. All the younger romantics, even for kids, we have also seen that Hellenism is one of the most important characteristics of kids. Here also, all younger romantics are lovers of Greek mythology. So Shelley's interest in the mythological stories of Greece finds expression in Hellas and Prometheus Unbound and many other short poems also. And the last point that I am going to discuss is didacticism. So there is a strong didactic sense in Shelley. So he often wishes to impress a moral upon us, but his method of giving us a moral is different from that of the neoclassical poet like Pope. He does not give us a moral directly that he would be unromantic. He merely paints a picture and leaves us to draw the moral outside. So in Ozymandias, for instance, Shelley does not directly tell us the human greatness and the splendor and the passion. He drives the moral home to us and by a picture of the broken statue of a mighty king on sand. So Shelley's place, if we think as a literary figure in literature, would be summed up as Matthew Arnold has beautifully told, and I have already mentioned in this lecture, that beautiful and ineffectual angel beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. So Sharp is also very vociferous in saying that the real is the true world of the great, but it was not that Shelley's world. So Shelley is one of the most stalwart poets of British romantic literature, British romantic literary period, and his place has been acknowledged securely by these qualities that I have already mentioned in permanently in the pedestal of romantic literature. So he belonged to the younger generation of romantic poets. Like other two poets of his generation, he died very young, and his poetry divides itself into two distinct modes. In one, he is the violent reformer, seeking to overthrow the present institutions in order to bring the golden millennium, a golden age. And out of this mood come most his longer poems like Queen Mab, The Revolt of Islam, Hellas, The Witch of Atlas, etc., which are somewhat violent denunciation of government, priests, marriage, religion, and even God as man supposed him to be. And in a different mode, which finds expression, is Alastair Adonis. He is a wanderer. He is a wanderer following a vague, beautiful vision forever, and sad and unsatisfied in nature. His greatness as a poet resides principally in his incomparable lyricism. So in this lecture, I wanted to incorporate the brief biographical traits, brief biographical timeline of P.B. Shelley, as well as his output as a author of the British Romantic era. And lastly, I have discussed several points in which I have mentioned the traits of his poetic qualities, the traits of his romanticism, and the traits that characterized him as a great poet, as a great stalwart indeed in the British romantic literary field. So before I proceed in my next lecture, the poem, the sonnet Ozymandias, it is better to have an idea, to gather this knowledge at least about P.B. Shelley, and then we will jump into the text in my next lecture. So I thank all of you for joining me here directly in this video lecture, and I once again warn you to stay at home and stay safe inside the four walls of your home, and don't step outside. Rather devote your time in studying texts, in studying literature, or doing some other necessary activities of day-to-day life. So I hope you all have enjoyed this particular video lecture, and this lecture will be continued, or the explanations and analysis will be continued of Ozymandias the text in my next lecture. Thank you for hearing, thank you for watching patiently, and once again, stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you.